Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Sony FE 16mm f1.8G, an ultra-wide prime lens for E-mount mirrorless cameras that's corrected for full-frame sensors. Announced in February 2025, it slots between the 14 1.8 G master and the 21.8 G in focal length, but is closest to the latter in both design and price. Costing around $800, it's roughly similar to the 21.8G while delivering comfortably wider coverage that's useful whether you're shooting big landscapes, interiors or astro, while also being ideal for handheld vloggers, especially when accommodating the crop from digital stabilization. It's also obviously less extreme than the 14 1.8 G master, not just in coverage but also price, with that lens costing at least half again. Plus, spoiler alert, the 16 takes standard filters too. But first things first, there's actually very little competition if you want a bright full-frame 16 in the Sony E-mount. There is the Viltrox AF 16 1.8 FE at about 2/3 the price, but Sony's aiming higher on quality, so let's see what it can do. In terms of design, the 16 1.8G follows existing G-series lenses, and I really like the style and feature set that Sony's now standardized on. The 74mm diameter is the same as the earlier 20 1.8G, but it's 10mm shorter at 75mm and lighter too at 304 grams. It's a compact and light lens that's perfect for smaller bodies, but the build quality is decent and it's also sealed against dust and moisture, including a rubber grommet at the mount and a fluorine coating on the front element. The controls start closest to the lens mount with a customizable focus hold button, a switch for auto and manual focus, and another switch that locks the aperture ring in the A position. Meanwhile, on the opposite side is a third switch for declicking the aperture ring. Next comes that aperture ring labelled from 1.8 to 22 in third stop increments, followed by A for body-based control if you prefer. Again, the ring is declickable for smooth and silent operation during video, and you can lock it in the A position if desired. Next comes a fairly narrow but silky smooth free spinning manual focusing ring with absolutely no scratchiness. Finally, at the end of the barrel is a 67mm filter thread, allowing it to conveniently accommodate standard filters, unlike wider lenses like the 14, which have a bulbous front, forcing either hefty solutions on the front or rear-mounted filters. And like other Sony lenses, there's a hood supplied as standard, which twists onto the bayonet mount. Focusing is swift and silent, courtesy of twin XD linear motors, snapping onto the subject for both photo and video. Here's how it looks for video using face detection and the maximum 1.8 aperture. It'll capture a huge field of view that could be used for environmental portraiture or presentations to camera, although obviously there will be distortion if you get too close. But step back even just slightly and you'll easily capture a waist-up view from very close range while avoiding too much stretching. Moving on to focus breathing, here's the lens manually focusing between infinity and the closest distance and back again, where you'll see the field of view shrink a little, like a mild zoom. It's not too bad though, and not particularly noticeable for focus pulls across more common distances. But if it bothers you and you want to reduce breathing, the lens does support compensation on recent bodies, as seen here on the A7 IV. It certainly minimised the change in coverage in return for a mild crop, but I'd say there's still a visible optical change towards the middle. It's there if you want it though. Next for my quality test, starting with a video clip to show the ultra-wide field of view on a more distant landscape. Again, I did all my tests using an A7 IV body. Like most new mirrorless lenses, the 16 1.8G employs a software profile to correct geometric distortion and corner darkening due to vignetting. It's applied to JPEGs automatically with the option grayed out in the menus, but if you shoot in RAW, you will need to make sure that the profile is enabled, or you're going to see distortion and darkening in the corners. Remember, this lens is not designed to be used without the profile. Now, anytime I mention software profiles, there's often complaints in the comments, but they do allow the engineers to concentrate optical corrections on trickier aberrations, delivering smaller and lighter lenses which can be sharp right into the corners, even at large apertures. And while the geometric correction does involve a stretch and a crop, the final field of view that you're going to get remains 16mm, and I'm going to be taking a detailed look at the corner sharpness in a moment to judge the impact, if any. Of course, brightening the corners will increase noise, but this technique has been used for years now, and you can choose to manage this yourself when processing RAW files if you prefer. So here's my standard landscape view, shot from a distance, as I do think it's important to test lenses both near and far. I've angled it here so that details run right into those corners. You're looking at the 16 1.8G wide open at 1.8 on an a7 IV body, again with all profile corrections enabled, as that is how the lens is designed to be used. Taking a closer look in the middle of the frame reveals sharp details right out of the gate with little to no benefit to stopping down. So let's return to the 1.8 sample before heading into the far corner. Here you'll see minor softening of detail at the extremes, at least when you focused on the middle of the frame, but it's certainly not bad. As I gradually close the aperture down, there's not much benefit until you reach, say, around 5.6, at which point the corners become visibly crisper. So if you're shooting a view with detail right into the corners, there's definitely some benefit to closing down, but again, I wouldn't say it's bad wide open. How about an even more distant subject? Here's a 2-second night shot taken with the aperture wide open at f1.8 and the camera at 400 ISO. It was easy to manually focus using the magnified view on the camera and the very smooth focusing ring, and I've adjusted the levels here to boost the brightness of the stars. Taking a closer look off center, you can see the star images remain mostly well behaved points of light. They're also not too bad in the far corners, although any in the extremes that are also particularly bright can exhibit coma at the maximum aperture. I did find though that this could be improved when stopping down even a fraction to f2. I also compared an uncorrected RAW file without the profiles applied and didn't notice any unusual star shapes in the corners of the JPEG with correction when comparing them side by side. Next, for a portrait where it's possible to capture broad surroundings and avoid too much distortion if, again, you're careful on distance and position. Zooming in also shows there's potential for some background separation, even from this distance and focal length with the aperture wide open at f1.8. But again, be careful on distance. Get too close and like all ultra wides, you'll of course suffer from unflattering distortion, although it does illustrate some potential for greater background blur, which you're going to see in many of my sample images later on. For a more formal look at background blur from close range, here's my fairy light test with the lens near to its minimum focusing distance of 15 cm. Note you can focus a tad closer to 13 cm if you switch to manual focus. Here you can see a decent degree of separation with the aperture wide open, while the bokeh blobs themselves are looking mostly well behaved with minimal outlining or textures within. Closing the aperture a tad to f2 slightly improves their slightly odd shape towards the corners, and by f2.8 onwards they're looking more uniformly circular. At the other end of the aperture scale, here's how the lens looks at the minimum aperture of f22, where you can enjoy some fairly well defined diffraction spikes on point sources. The 22 spikes here indicate a diaphragm system with 11 blades, and again I'd say Sony's done a pretty good job with the shape of those blades, allowing non-distracting bokeh at larger apertures without losing out on nice sharp diffraction spikes at the smaller ones. And finally, a handheld vlogging test, as this is going to be a popular use for this lens, starting here filming 4K on the a7 IV without any stabilisation at all. Inevitably there's some wobbles, but it actually may be acceptable if you're a bit more careful than I am. For my second clip, I've enabled standard steady shot on the a7 IV, which is using sensor shift IBIS alone. It's smoothed out some of the footage while avoiding the edge warping that's often visible with ultra-wides and IBIS, but there's still a visible shudder with each step. So next, for active steady shot, which applies additional digital compensation in return for a mild crop. This has visibly improved the steadiness while still delivering a decent wide view. And with fewer wobbles, you can also appreciate the background blur and attractive rendering. Previously, the 21.8 was one of my favourite vlogging lenses for Sony bodies, but it could become uncomfortably tight once active steady shot had been applied. Now, the wider coverage of the 16 means that there's greater latitude for digital compensation while still delivering a nice wide view. Which brings me to my final verdict, during which I'll show you more images taken with the 16 1.8G on a Sony a7 IV body. The FE 16mm 1.8G is a very welcome addition to Sony's lens catalogue, delivering the drama of ultra-wide coverage with the convenience of a compact barrel that can take standard 67mm filters. Sony's now standard design for these lenses is very well featured, sealed against dust and moisture and including a declickable aperture ring, custom focus hold button and silky smooth manual focusing. In my test, the results were sharp in the middle and pretty respectable in the corners at the maximum aperture, sharpening up as you closed it down. I also noticed no obvious negative effects from the software profiles in my test images. Meanwhile, the 1.8 aperture can provide nice background blur, especially at close range, and there's plenty of opportunity for that at the minimum focusing distance of 15 cm with autofocus. It also topples the earlier 1.8G as my favourite handheld vlogging lens for Sony's system, with the wider coverage accommodating the crop from digital stabilisation without becoming too tight. So, in the absence of much competition, it's an easy lens to recommend at the price. Note that I've not tested the Viltrox 16mm, so if you've got any experience with that lens, do let me know what you think of it. Which brings me to the end of this review. As always, if you found it useful, please do consider giving it a like and my channel a follow. Just 2 clicks that really make a difference and are very much appreciated. Let me know what you think of the lens in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.